The Summer Games Minute, brought to you by Mass Mutual. For most professional athletes, versatility means they can play a few different positions in a single sport. For Babe Dietrichson-Zaharias, versatility means dominance across the entire spectrum of sport. In the 1932 Summer Games in Los Angeles, Zaharias won gold in the 80-meter hurdles and the javelin throw, plus she got a silver in the high jump. Running, throwing, jumping wasn't enough for Babe, so she became a competitive billiards player, then jumped into professional golf, winning 10 major championships, all the while making a few pitching appearances in Major League Baseball spring training games. Mass Mutual understands the nuances in how women want and need to manage their finances. With quality product solutions and guidance, a Mass Mutual financial professional can help you plan for both short-term and long-term money goals. Learn more and get started at massmutual.com.
As you've probably heard by now, we've teamed up with BetMGM this season. We'll be using BetMGM lines to make all of our picks, and we'll have special offers for our listeners each week. If you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager with BetMGM. Here's how it works. Download the BetMGM app and sign up using bonus code The Athletic. Make your first deposit of at least $10. Place your first bet on any game and claim your voucher for a 1-year subscription to The Athletic. See BetMGM.com for terms. U.S. promotional offers not available in D.C., Mississippi, New York, Nevada, Ontario, or Puerto Rico. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Available in the U.S. Call 877-8-HOPE-NY or text HOPE-NY 467-369 in New York. Call 1-800-NEXT-STEP in Arizona. 1-800-327-5050 in Massachusetts. 1-800-BETS-OFF in Iowa. 1-800-270-7117 for confidential help in Michigan. 1-800-981-0023 in Puerto Rico. First bet offer for new customers only in partnership with Kansas Crossing Casino and Hotel. Don't forget, if you haven't signed up for BetMGM yet, use bonus code The Athletic, and you'll get a 1-year subscription to The Athletic, plus up to a $1,500 first bet offer on your first wager.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
The Athletic.
The race is on, and the latest piece in the driver market puzzle has slotted into place with Ollie Bearman confirmed at Haas ahead of a British Grand Prix weekend when the Verstappen versus Norris fallout from Austria will be a big talking point. I'm Edd Straw, and joining me to hit the big topics ahead of Silverstone is Scott Mitchell-Malm. Scott, you're back.
I am back and joining you physically in person. Now, probably, I don't know if we've got such amazing rapport, Ed, that people would have just been completely stunned to discover that this is actually going to be our first race on site together since Bahrain, because we've just been alternating being Mark Hughes' teammate, haven't we, since then?
Yeah, there's been a lot of rotation. I've even occasionally not had Mark Hughes as a teammate because nobody can get to China. But no, we do rotate around a little bit between the three of us.
And it's just been a bit, I would say, just coincidence, and a very, very weird coincidence that the way that it shook out was that we just had this massive run of races where I was either working remotely or you were working remotely. But yeah, the boys are back together, and it's actually going to be a full contingent this weekend, isn't it? It might be the first time this season we've had that. So looking forward to the nonsense that we can come up with between us.
Exactly, and this should be a fun podcast. We're just around the corner from Silverstone ahead of the British Grand Prix, and of course there is a little bit of risk involved. If you hear a thud, that will be Scott headbutting the
seconds before we hit record. I am precariously, not that precariously positioned next to this bookshelf, whatever it is, that I should have hit my head, but clearly positioned carefully enough that I can hit my head if I am indeed a moron, which unfortunately I did prove to myself to be.
It made a very satisfying noise.
Yeah, not satisfying. Like, we both found it raucously funny afterwards. I'm so gutted that you hadn't pressed record, because there is normally about 90 seconds of nonsense, not including this bit, but there is normally 90 seconds of nonsense before we actually start talking about the podcast properly. And it would have been brilliant for the end of year blooper reel if me twatting my head on that shelf had made it in.
Well, there's every chance you'll make one of those hilarious jokes you think you make and throw your head back and laugh, and it'll happen. So listeners can be poised to see if that happens,
or hear if that happens.
Yes, very much so. Some may be watching. Is anyone watching at the window? No, it's just an owl or something. Anyway, you may hear some wildlife in the background, but let's talk about Ollie Bearman, because we've been expecting him to be confirmed for Haas for 2025 pretty much since the end of last season. But why is the driver currently holding 14th in the F2 standings always been so nailed on?
Yeah, this has been a long time coming. You're right, since the end of 2023, this has looked absolutely on the cards, and I would say it's been locked in since the start of the year. I don't think...
And almost since Mexico, that FP1, where he really made the impression.
Yeah, absolutely. Really. And I think with that I think he was basically locked in from the point of that expanded FP1 programme being confirmed. My suspicion, I don't know this, maybe we'll find out a little bit more once we get into the paddock. But yeah, the nature of these deals, that they have conditions attached to them. There are targets attached to them, and it wouldn't surprise. Honestly, with how won over Haas was by the end of last year, and how serious Ferrari is about Bearman, it wouldn't surprise me if that six FP1 outing program was done with a 2025 seat all but signed.
Yeah,
anyway.
Well, and it's worth noting, actually, that I asked Io Komatsu, the team principal at Haas, about this earlier this year, about whether that's to prepare Bearman for a race seat in 25. And he said, well, yes. And that's obvious, but usually team bosses in that scenario are a little bit more cautious about it, whereas he was never kind of denying that. And we know that Io is a big fan of Bearman ever since that Mexico FP1.
Yeah, Komatsu has been talking him up constantly since then. So when Bearman did that Mexico FP1 outing, I think there were three key elements to it that were so impressive about Haas. One was he was pushing fairly aggressively from essentially his first flying lap. He looked comfortable in the car. And bear in mind, at that point, I think he'd done a lot of TPC work with Ferrari, but this was his first time driving that Haas.
I've just got to interrupt and point out that you were watching this all the way through live. You were following this session.
Yeah, I watched it
super closely.
Yeah, I watched every single lap. I heard every radio message. I think I logged every single sector time he did from that session. And from that first lap, he was already a respectable distance away from I can't remember, this is embarrassing considering I did follow it that closely, but I think he was up against Hulkenberg. I think he had Magnussen's car. Yeah. I think he had Magnussen's car.
I'll check that while you talk.
Yeah. And that first flying lap was already solid, but by the end of that first run, so obviously we know that they go out, especially in FP1, and they'll do not necessarily continuous laps. They might do a push-call push or whatever. By the end of that first run, Bearman was very, very close to where you would expect any driver to be in that scenario, let alone someone driving the car for the very first time. So that was the first point. They were very impressed from that first run, how comfortable he looked in the car and the fact that he was asserting himself on the car.
News just in, it was indeed in Magnussen's car against Hulkenberg.
Excellent, which I would argue makes it even more impressive, given we know that Hulkenberg is the faster of the two, especially over one lap. The second element that impressed them was where he was then at by the end of the session. So in the long run work that he'd done and the low fuel work, what he was able to get out of that car, I think he was a couple of tenths or 3 tenths away, and the lap time was not a problem, but nor was the conduct over the pace in the quote-unquote long runs that he was able to do was impressive as well. And the third thing that really impressed them is something that had impressed them already behind the scenes before and since FP1, but it is something that bears talking about through a session itself, is his maturity and awareness of the bigger picture. It's not enough for these drivers to just be quick in a racing car. Most of them are. You could probably put half the F2 grid in an F1 car for an FP1, and if you put them on softs and told them go and do a quick lap, they could probably do it. Replicating that in competitive sessions is obviously very difficult, but there has to be a broader understanding of what it's all about. You have to be able to work with the team. You have to be able to process information very, very quickly. And more importantly, I think you need to be able to progress. You need to be able to borrow a McLaren Andrea Stella phrase, you have to be able to cash in on those opportunities to improve, which I think is a really neat way of putting it. And Bearman showed that in spades. So Komatsu was just waxing lyrical about the kid thereafter. And when Bearman then did that Ferrari stand-in performance in Saudi Arabia, Komatsu said after that he was not at all surprised by how he'd conducted himself based on what they'd seen in that Mexico FP1.
Yeah, he's 3.5 tenths off Hülkenberg in Mexico in that practice session, just to fill in that gap, seeing as I had the results up in front of me. But yeah, I think what the Saudi Ferrari drive showed as well is I always say, when somebody gets an opportunity like this, I always say it's a cometh the hour moment. You know, the phrase is cometh the hour, cometh the man, isn't it? And it's
Cometh the Bearman.
Exactly. But it's a chance in difficult circumstances to show you can hack it. And what I don't think Bearman showed anything in terms of pace in Saudi. He was quick, but what I mean is that wasn't what was impressive. What was impressive is he could jump in on Saturday.
Not overawed.
In a Ferrari at that circuit where if something goes wrong, challenging drivers' track, you can have huge shunts. I was hugely impressed by the mental strength he showed in seizing that opportunity. Now, he was pretty much on course for a Haas drive anyway before that, but that, if there was any doubt, the way he took that opportunity just showed he's got the mentality to do it in F1, which is hugely important.
I would say that the one thing you should take from Bearman and his position in all of this is from the TPC work with Ferrari, from the FP1s with Haas, from that stand-in performance in Jeddah, as you've elaborated on there, Ed. Ferrari's not taken a driver this seriously since Charles Leclerc, and properly mega young drivers, they don't come around every season. The best teams with the best driver academies shouldn't be pumping out Leclerc or Max Verstappen level drivers on a yearly basis, because that's the whole point of a Leclerc, Max Verstappen level driver. Like, they come around every now and again, but with everything that we've seen and with everything we've heard from the people that rate him, have worked with him so closely, they rate him at this level. Ferrari would not be taking this level of interest with Bearman if they did not think this is another Leclerc.
And there's greater interest in him than there was in Mick Schumacher or Antonio Giovinazzi. Both drivers Ferrari respect. Obviously, Giovinazzi, still a very successful Ferrari driver. But yeah, it's basically the sequence has been Bianchi, Leclerc, Bearman in terms of the ones that Ferrari think, actually, these could be ones that have a very good chance of being future Ferrari drivers. The others were maybe, but we think their level is maybe just below that. But they're not. It doesn't mean Bearman's definitely going to be in a Ferrari a few years down the line. He's got quite a bit of work to do before that could happen. But they think, this guy could have something.
Well, cast your mind back to Jeddah, and I think Fred Vasseur was being asked already off the back of that performance, is he the driver who replaces Lewis Hamilton at Ferrari at the end of Lewis's either first deal or if he does an extension beyond that? We know that Lewis is going there on a multi-year deal. He's going to be there in 25 and 26 at the very least. Is Bearman Leclerc's teammate in 27? Is he Hamilton's teammate in 27 if Leclerc goes somewhere else? That was already what was being talked about. And obviously Fred, who is probably to some people when he talks about stuff maybe like a bit boring on these topics, but he's so sensible. Fred knows what it takes to get a driver into F1 and to get the most out of them. He was the one who had Leclerc in his first season in F1 at Sauber back in 2018. So Vasseur was obviously sidestepping that and saying, Hamilton's not even in the car yet, so let's not talk about his replacement. But you're right, that drivers of this calibre, they're put into the programmes that they're put into with a view to being a Ferrari driver in the end. Schumacher was potentially on that trajectory if all the stars aligned and he excelled. But I don't think it's unfair to say that Ferrari didn't have him in F1 with the expectation of him being a Ferrari driver in the end. And I think that's different with Bearman. I think there is an expectation there that he should be good enough to be in a Ferrari F1 car one day.
Yeah, I don't think he's quite as nailed on as Leclerc was at an equivalent time, because I think they really thought Leclerc. But I'd maybe say similar territory to Bianchi, because Bianchi was very highly rated. There are a few things he was needing to prove, and obviously if the tragedy hadn't happened, he'd have been in a Sauber and there'd been a few boxes to tick, but he was possibly on a trajectory and they thought, there's a decent chance. Bearman seems to be in that sort of level, so it doesn't necessarily mean he will be a Ferrari driver, although he already has been obviously once, but it's definitely possible. And that's great for Haas, because they've got a driver who not only is going to be very good for them, he's going to be very quick, he's going to get results. It's also someone who's got something to shoot for and something to prove, so he won't be able to rest on his laurels, and I think he'll do a good job for them. It's worth raising the question of who his teammate should be. Were I Haas, I would be very, very keen on having an experienced teammate there, because I think they do need an experienced hand. That team of all teams probably still does need experience.
Well, if you look at the standings, there are 13 better drivers than Bearman in F2. Haas could just pick one of those, couldn't they, and have an all-rookie lineup?
Easy choice, yeah, isn't it? Well, obviously we've talked a few times on a podcast and members pods on how F2 performances aren't necessarily a great barometer at this stage, given Prama's struggles. But yeah, what would you be doing if you were Gene Haas in terms of deciding on his teammate?
I don't think there's a rookie driver that I would punt on. And I say that knowing full well that I don't think Gene would do that anyway, even if there was one. I don't think he's that way inclined on drivers.
I think it would be madness to put a rookie in onside unless there were an absolute mega. If they could get Antonelli, let's say, I'd maybe do that. But short of that, no.
If I'm in charge of that team, you're asking me that hypothetical. If I can get the two best rookies around in that car, I would. But I think you're right in this situation with who is available. I think one rookie's enough, especially when one rookie has great potential like Bearman does, and you know that you're bringing Bearman in for at least a couple of years, so you're not going to waste all that work in the first season. I'd be surprised if, given the contracts that they have, Leclerc and Hamilton go anywhere from Ferrari in the next couple of seasons. But stranger things have happened in F1. So you're looking at those. You're looking at those experienced options that are available. You've missed out on Hülkenberg, which I believe was not just because Audi had Uber bucks to throw at Hülkenberg and that won him over. I think there was an element of Haas not necessarily being able to counter that offer because Gene tends to not go for drivers before the summer break, which is one of the reasons why the Bearman thing is sort of, you can say for certainty it's been locked down for a while, because it feels like they're almost picking the timing of it around his home Formula One weekend.
Yeah, that contract's been signed for a while.
Yeah, exactly. So who's available? So then you're looking at, realistically, there were talks with Carlos Sainz. You'd obviously try and go for him, but he's shooting higher than that. So then you're in your...
Only just.
Yes. Valtteri Bottas and Esteban Ocon are then the next ones. If I were in that situation, I think in terms of what he could bring to the team all round, I'd be moving mountains to try and get Bottas in that car. But all signs do seem to point to Ocon going there, because there are some concerns about Ocon with obviously the reputation that he has, and the not just reputation, because it's not just on hearsay, the evidence of him clashing with teammates and fighting too much with teammates, despite being a very good driver. He'd be a great driver. He'd be an upgrade on Kevin Magnussen. He'd be faster, but he'd clash with his teammates just as much. He's
basically a better Magnussen, and I don't mean that nasty on either of them. I hold Ocon in high regard. Magnussen is a driver I do like. Remember when he came back? I remember us sitting in our apartment in Bahrain, just saying how good it was to have Kevin Magnussen back in Formula 1. But I do think Ocon gives you quite a lot of what Magnussen does, only a big step better. So yeah, those Bottas and Ocon are obvious candidates. I think I'd agree with your philosophy in that I personally would probably aim for Bottas. Very, very good at working with bringing on a rookie teammate. He's done great work with Zhou Guanyu. He really buys into that. Ocon won't do that. Doesn't have to. Different drivers, different approaches and skill sets, but both of those would be great options for Haas if they don't get snapped up elsewhere.
Yeah, which is the key thing. So I don't think it's a terrible position to have, Magnussen is basically your backup, which is where I think Haas is. He's talking like someone who expects to be moving on from F1 next year, but there's a non-zero chance Haas needs him.
Well, if you do the maths, there's an Alpine drive, there's a Haas drive, there's an Audi Sauber drive, and there's a Williams drive, and you've got Sainz, Ocon, Bottas. So there's the three obvious choices. And then who's that one.
Where. So depends what seats available.
Exactly, it depends what happens. So, for example, if Alpine end up with Doohan, then that all elegantly adds up. Then it's Bottas or Ocon in a Haas, and then Audi and Williams for the other one. But yeah, they might need Magnussen. I think they probably might end up having to have Magnussen if kind of what's likely to happen happens, and Alpine doesn't have Doohan, and they get maybe Sainz. But that's still very much a coin toss. I don't think Sainz is as likely to go to Alpine as maybe some in Alpine think.
Yeah, it is. So I would say that if you end up with Magnussen at Haas, the good thing for the team and Bearman in that scenario is that now that Hülkenberg's come in and comprehensively beaten Magnussen over a couple of seasons, this version of Magnussen is now an even clearer reference, and Bearman has to beat him. There's no excuse for... And that's harsh to ask for a rookie, but if we're taking him as seriously as you want to take a Leclerc type when they come into Formula 1, he has to beat Magnussen because we know the level he's at. When Schumacher went into that team and then got Magnussen in the second year after Nikita Mazepin. And the chain of teammates since then exposes just how bad that Mazepin season was. Schumacher went up against a driver that didn't have a stellar reputation from his first F1 career, but was then roundly beaten by him, even though there were some people in that team that weren't sure that Magnussen was at 100% every weekend, because Kevin Magnussen isn't at 100% every single weekend.
What you get from him. He is a bit erratic, and that's just what you get. And I like Kevin Magnussen, but personally, if I was Haas, if I ended up having to hang on to Magnussen, I'd probably be a little bit disappointed with that, even though actually I'd be quite happy if Magnussen was still on the grid, just from a interesting driver to have on the grid perspective. But that would feel like not that they've lost, but I feel like it would be very much second prize in the driver market.
No, absolutely would. Whereas if they end up with one of Sainz, Bottas or Ocon, and they're not going to end up with Sainz, but if you look at the free agents, there are a lot of good options, and they should end up with a genuinely good one. If they end up with Magnussen as the backup, it's not the end of the world. And my point really with Bearman is that you at least know then how he's performing. Because if he's 2 tenths clear of Magnussen, you think, well, Hülkenberg's usually a tenth or two clear of Magnussen at most weekends, then you're like, okay, Bearman's performing at a really high level here. But if he's a tenth or two off Magnussen every single weekend, so the point I would make is that Haas probably then in that situation doesn't need to second guess how good its car is. It doesn't need to think, oh, where are we right now? And actually, is Bearman getting the most out of this? Value, yeah. Magnussen will be that yardstick, and he'll be below average is unfair because it makes it sound like I'm saying he's rubbish. But we know that Magnussen's not getting the most out of that car every weekend, so you can probably take a 2/10 tax or something like that, and that's what you're judging Bearman against. So you would at least get something out of it if you put a rookie in, or best will in the world because he's a perfectly nice guy, and I think he did all right when he came into F1, but he's slumped since then. If you put Zhou Guanyu in that car, you're getting nothing out of that in terms of judging Bearman. Yeah, that's very true, and they don't seem to be interested at all in Zhou. And yeah, obviously we've got to say there's the RB driver situation, so a Ricciardo or a Lawson could be possible, but I don't see massive interest in those at the moment. No, but that's mainly because they're not perceived to be available, so that would be interesting. I mean, if it comes down to you can't get Bottas or Ocon, and it's Magnussen or Ricciardo, keeping Magnussen's not a slam dunk over signing Ricciardo who's been rejected by Red Bull. I'd agree with that. I don't think I'd take Lawson over Magnussen necessarily, because that again, then you've got inexperience and so on and so forth. The only thing with that is that I just think, as well as obviously the question mark still over how good Ricciardo is, although I do think the evidence is starting to build up that he's been a bit. He does seem to be on a slightly better trajectory now. I think he's been decent this year. It's, you know, even when he's been disappointed and struggling this year, he's never been McLaren level struggle. Nothing like that. No. It's just been a little bit off Tsunoda. Yeah, I agree. But even with that, the concern I have is I don't think Haas is going to pay his salary. I don't think Gene is willing to put that kind of money out there. I think that's probably true, yeah. And to be honest, I don't know whether it justifies a team like Haas. So I just think it also, that's why I said at the start, all signs point to Ocon going to Haas. And as an all-round, I mean, first of all, as a pairing, you know, you're going to have a handful of weekends over the year where you have the fourth best driver pairing on the grid. Because we know Ocon in those moments where he absolutely nails it is so good. I mean, you look at Ocon's history, and there are relatively frequent, really outstanding drives. There are half a dozen weekends a year, I think, where Ocon is really good. And then there are probably a dozen weekends where he's good, and there are half a dozen where he's blaming weird things. Something's gone wrong. We need to change stuff on the car because I don't understand it. I think that's your breakdown of an Esteban Ocon season. It's 6 great weekends, 12 good weekends, and 6 sort of gone slightly missing weekends. Yeah, and I think if they can get Ocon, that's a great signing for Haas. But obviously they're downstream in the driver market still. So once again, everyone's just waiting for Carlos Sainz.
You know we love talking stats here at The Athletic. Here's one that's super simple to remember. Discover automatically doubles the cash back you've earned on your credit card at the end of your first year with Cashback Match. That means with Discover, you could turn $150 cash back to $300. That's right. You could put it towards some memorabilia you've had your eye on, or treat yourself to a premium sports network. You earn and Discover doubles. See terms at discover.com/credit card.
We'll get back to the pod in a moment, but first of all, let me tell you about Grammarly. Email, Google Docs, Slack, you write across multiple platforms and places during your workday, so delivering consistent, high-quality communication everywhere is key. Grammarly is an AI writing partner that helps you get work done faster with high-quality writing for better projects, proposals, presentations, and more. Best of all, Grammarly works where you work, so you can get more done no matter what tools you use. As a journalist and podcast host, I'm constantly writing and rewriting copy and drawing up scripts. It's part of the job, and Grammarly helps make it faster. It's got some really cool features like tone suggestions to help you strike the right balance between direct and friendly in work emails. Plus, Grammarly has a ton of other great features like advanced spelling, grammar, punctuation, and conciseness suggestions to ensure your writing is professional, mistake-free, and clear. Get AI writing support that works where you work. Sign up and download for free at grammarly.com/podcast. That's GRAMMARLY.com/podcast. Easier said, done.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, bit to get 30, bit to get 20, 20, 20, bit to get 20, 20, bit to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Right, Scott, let's talk Max Verstappen and Lando Norris. Is this really going to be a row that's rumbling on this weekend, do you think?
Well, I think it depends on what they say on Thursday, because we know from what Christian Horner has said that that the two of them have supposedly spoken and cleared the air since Austria. That would imply that Verstappen reached out to Norris, because Norris did say that the onus was on Verstappen to do that.
Well, there's an interesting thing because Norris went on radio, and there's some quotes from that appeared on Wednesday, and there's a reference he makes about, it's hard to be as accurate as it looks on TV. Sometimes it's those 2 centimetres off, and that for me sounds a bit like Verstappen. I felt Verstappen had noticed this when he saw the replay. I think Verstappen, he wasn't trying to hit Norris. I think he squeezed him that little bit more than he thought he was.
I also think he thought that Norris was going to use the curb, because that's what a lot of drivers do.
Which Norris didn't have to. So I think my complete guess would be probably the conversation's gone a bit that way, and that's why they're kind of love with that. That's how I interpret
I
the
did
quotes.
say on the post-race podcast that the friendship wouldn't necessarily, because Verstappen doesn't like holding his hands up, but the friendship might be an influencing factor there. Verstappen's comfortable enough with Norris on a personal level, and also professionally probably just thinks
there's enough respect. There's enough respect.
But also professionally probably thinks I've got him covered, that he doesn't mind saying to him, actually, do you know what? I actually didn't think I was that far over on you, or he'll maybe he framed it in a kind of, well, I was just expecting you to go onto the curb, but obviously you didn't, so yeah, I didn't leave enough room or whatever. Anyway, that's all that could be swept under the rug. By the time the cars hit the track in Friday FP1, it could be a non-topic. But what won't be able to just be kind of dismissed as anything is how it changes things on track. And we talked about this a little bit post-race, but for me, the interesting thing is definitely what Norris does next, because there's so much there that can change based on how Norris decides to react to what happened.
Well, we've got some questions about that, and obviously there's loads of the Race Members Club questions, so we can rattle through a few. We will get to that point about Norris. The first one's from Andrew Dale. Will F1 ever take more serious action against Verstappen, given its long history of over-aggression in wheel-to-wheel racing?
I think the danger there is that you end up trying to prosecute him on a total body of evidence over many years, which isn't how F1 works or how stewarding works.
And I don't think it's about action against Verstappen. I think it's a general F1 thing, not a driver specific one.
I agree, but where you might, if you don't take it quite so literally, what you might say is that have there been times over recent years where stewards have been inclined to not police Verstappen's overtaking or driving as harshly or as accurately as they might another driver? It's the kind of classic F1 version of in football in the Premier League where people, fans of certain clubs, genuinely believe that referees are biased towards the big clubs and help, big clubs get softer penalties and stuff like that, because they're just trying to sort of preserve the status quo. And I think in 2021 we saw this priority of entertainment and the spectacle. So Verstappen was able to get away with a little bit more in 21 than I think he'd get away with now. I don't think it's about them taking a stand against him so much as just making sure they actually know what they want their rules of racing to be. And if they then actually establish that and they want to do it consistently, then they just hold Verstappen to the same standard as everybody else. Because if he carries on driving the way he does, and Christian Horner has said he won't change, then if we have hard but fair racing rules, Verstappen will stray over that line more than others because he pushes to the limit more than anyone else does.
And also, though, he will play to the way the rules are applied as well. That's also something that will happen. So, you can't blame anyone for playing to the way the rules are enforced. And as you say, then it comes down to his willingness to push it right to the very limit. And there's a related question from Stuart Harlan that I'll take, who says, so finally we have our question answered of how Max would behave when put properly under pressure in battle on track, moving under braking repeatedly, and would clearly rather risk colliding than concede the win. Do you see this as a weakness that needs correcting, or just what makes Max the brilliantly fast driver he is? Well, I think when you're looking in general, I think it is part of what makes him the brilliantly fast driver he is, in that it's always no compromise, do absolutely everything you can to win, leave nothing on the table. That's a brilliant quality. It's up to him how he sets the risk versus reward barometer in that, and whether he thinks there's times when it's sensible to accept second place. Well, I will say, from my perspective, I do think it's an important part of a driver to know when to fight certain battles, etc. I think, generally speaking, in that Austria fight, he'd have been better off not getting the puncher. Or and if you watch the footage, as soon as he basically makes the contact with Norris, the tyre's off the bead and he's in trouble. And actually, he gained in the championship over Norris, funnily enough, from that. But that was completely uncontrollable. It could have gone the other way. And I do think it is important sometimes. I know he said the stuff about I'm not here to race for second, but sometimes you need to live to fight another day. And this was one of the things I felt in Silverstone 21. Always dangerous bringing that clash up, but it's people misinterpret this as blaming Verstappen for that. I purely look at it situationally, and if I was him in Silverstone 21, I'd have thought, I'm very well ahead on points in the championship. I can probably come back at him later. This probably isn't one to risk the contact over. So that's how I play it a little bit differently. I think he'll benefit from maybe factoring in that in a little bit more, but he doesn't have to. Different people can play the game in different ways. There's no one way of doing it. So personally, I think he probably would benefit a bit from correcting that slightly, and that also might make it easier when things start to go wrong, not to be too under pressure to kind of desperately grasp at holding on to a lead that he can't. But ultimately, it's not something that's destroying him as a driver or anything. So, it refines with all of them. But the way they play the game, can vary. And actually, I'm not quite so hardline in terms of how drivers have to work. It comes back to that point of the way rules are enforced and applied, etc. I'm not sort of out there with the pitchforks and saying Verstappen has to be run out of Formula One, as some people seem to be saying. He pushes it, certainly, and that's down to him to calibrate. And it's great that you have different drivers who have different approaches. The next question is from Simon Rice, who says, is that the first time we've seen Max genuinely under pressure since 2021? And Fabian H asks if it's now evident Red Bull cars being dominant allowed Verstappen to mellow in 2022 and 2023, as now it seems to be back to 2021.
I don't think it's back to 2021. I would agree with the point that you made and raise it in a slightly different context here, Ed, which is that it is a weakness that we see Verstappen drive this way, so that can happen at any time. So this isn't a 2021 thing that's just been revived. This has always been there. It's just dormant because he has been dominant for so long. But he was under pressure at the start of 2022. In fact, if you remember, after the first two races in 2022, it was one each. Leclerc got the better of Verstappen in Bahrain, and Verstappen got the better of Leclerc in Saudi Arabia. And in that situation, Verstappen didn't resort to this, I think, for two reasons. One, very early in the season, he knows that the car isn't quite there. He's overreaching a little bit, potentially fighting for the victory, but crucially, it's all in his hands. He could have won that first race, and he didn't. Leclerc was just better on the day. He could have won in Saudi, and he did. In Austria, I think it was just that kind of that version of events that I think brings out the worst in Verstappen, which is just when he's losing control of the Grand Prix. And when he's losing control of it and he doesn't think he can get it back, it's I have to preserve the lead, because if I lose it, I've lost the race, and then he can't cede defeat. Whereas those battles in 22 were so different. He was trying to take the lead, he was trying to win, he was trying to beat Leclerc, he was on the offensive. Verstappen on the attack and Verstappen on the defence can create quite different outcomes, I think, in battle. And also we've seen several times in the last couple of years where he has had fights and he has fought cleanly. So it really does depend on the circumstances of the race as well as the battle.
Yeah, I think Austria was probably an extreme case in terms of the effect it had on him, because it was team errors that put him in harm's way, ultimately. So I can see why that's frustrating. He had the race won, ultimately.
Didn't he have a quite scruffy Singapore in 22 after the team had screwed up with his fuel in quali? And he reacted really badly to that after qualifying.
There was a mistake in the race.
And in the race was quite scruffy. So that's what I mean. Like those moments where like the equilibrium has been disturbed, and there's some discontent with him and the team, and he just can't control things the way he wants to.
I think it's just that old phrase, isn't it? The perfect is the enemy of the good. And Verstappen strives for perfection. You hear it throughout practice sessions. We've got to get this right. We've got to get this right. And that's great. And that 99% of the time yields brilliant results. But just once in a while, just accept you've got to make the best of a situation that isn't perfect, isn't as it should be. And just use that to calibrate the way you approach things.
And I would just point out as well, Verstappen's biggest critic on Sunday, I think, was Andrea Stella, the McLaren team principal, who 24 hours before that had held Verstappen up in a media session as the benchmark that all drivers in 2024 have an ambition to match. That's how good Verstappen's been this year.
Yeah.
And he even cited the sprint race in which Verstappen had triumphed over Norris as proof of how he can race without any contact or hint of contact whatsoever. Now, Stella didn't feel that way after the Grand Prix because of the specific circumstances. And what I would stress is, even though I think Verstappen was in the wrong on Sunday, and I didn't like elements of his driving even before the contact, that doesn't mean that's how he always is. And I think that stellar contrast, Saturday to Sunday, is worth people bearing in mind, because the same person who was vilifying him on Sunday post-race, 24 hours before, had been praising him for how good he can be in battle. So this isn't just a generic Verstappen go out racing. There are just specific situations, I think, that bring the worst out of him, and in those moments he crosses the line.
And that's the challenge all drivers, even the greats, face. None of the greatest Formula 1 drivers, and Max Verstappen is unquestionably one of them, were without slight weaknesses. That's just the nature of it. And there's always areas where you can just chip away and just make that decision-making and approach better. There's a question from Chris Shaw, which is, for me, Max Verstappen's talent and credentials can't be questioned. However, is he at risk of having his legacy tarnished in a similar way to Michael Schumacher? There is a right way to win and to lose. Well, it's funny, Schumacher legacy tarnished? I'm not sure it really is. I accept there's some people who will be very critical of Michael Schumacher for certain things. And I should add, Max Verstappen hasn't done an Adelaide 94 or a Jerez 97 or a Rascasse 2006, has he?
I think if he'd won the 2021 title off the back of what happened in Jeddah in 21, I think that would have made the list.
Yeah, potentially. Although even then, it's still not quite as extreme as some of these. But although, yeah, you can make a case for that. But anyway, I just think it's part and parcel of it, because you can look at the way I look at some of those Schumacher moments is I think it's a little bit related to Verstappen in that there's that, right, I've got to win. I'm a single-minded winning machine. And it's almost Schumacher just almost instinctively reached for the nuclear option and would have a collision just because that was just the last thing, and he just sort of that desire to win sent him down that way. I'm not trying to exonerate him from responsibility or anything, but I just think it's part and parcel of the drivers. I think there's wonderful elements of Max Verstappen that are connected to the fact that he has had some incidents on track. Same with, say, Ayrton Senna or someone like that. Same with Schumacher. So I think it's part of it. There's a right way to win and to lose. Well, I'd agree with that to an extent, but it varies from person to person. And we have to remember this is a game, this is a sport. It's an artificial playing field where the rules are not inviolable moral codes or anything other. You know, they are rules as written, and the way you approach those rules, it is legitimate when you're playing the game to bend the rules or try and get round them. If you think, well, there's a punishment for that, so I'll quite happily go into it and see what happens. So it's a slightly convoluted way of answering. I think it'll be part of Verstappen's legacy, but I don't think he's got to. There haven't been the volume of the ultra problematic instance with Schumacher, and I still think Schumacher's legacy is fantastic. He's absolutely one of the all-time greats. Him and Verstappen are both going to be up there, along with the others who don't have some of those negatives. There's a question for you, Scott, from Chris and Gandhi. Do you feel that Lando Norris will become a lot more aggressive in combat with Max, like Lewis Hamilton did in 2021 and Charles Leclerc in 2019? And Paul Hodgen asks if the only way to beat Max is to be just as aggressive as he is.
I don't think it requires an additional level of aggression from where Norris was at in Austria.
And a couple of times he overstepped a little bit when he was doing those chucks up the inside, and with that he just overcommitted.
If anything, Norris just needs to find that limit and rein it in slightly on those moments so that he can nail it maybe sort of slightly quicker. But I hinted at this in the post-race one. I'm not going to repeat it, just for context. I really like that Norris was experimenting with lines and moves on Verstappen, trying to work out what would work, what wouldn't. But the key with what Leclerc did in 2019 and Hamilton as well in 2021, and again, this is going to sound overly critical of Verstappen, but I'm just using it as the easiest bit of language to describe it. They didn't stoop to Verstappen's level or anything like that. They've both made mistakes in battle against him, Leclerc and Hamilton. So Norris is in good company there. But Leclerc and Hamilton have also beaten Verstappen in combat. And they don't do that by then suddenly turning it, and then, well, we're at the scene of what happened in 2021, so ironic that I say this now. They didn't resort that to just stuffing Verstappen into the barriers every chance they could get, or running him off the road or anything like that. But they didn't stand down. They raced him his way in terms of being uncompromising, in terms of being hard. But they just kept fighting him. And that's the key thing. With drivers like Verstappen exist in all forms of motorsport, right down to the grassroots level. I remember, in the most basic of circumstances, I remember being in karting, looking around myself on dummy grids going out, and there were, if you knew if you had one or two drivers in particular starting right behind you on the grid, you just knew like that they scared you, they spooked you. They're present. Verstappen has that,
and I know from racing as well. When you're racing against people regularly in a championship, every single driver, you know who those drivers are. You know who the soft touches are. I know there's drivers who, if I chuck it up the inside, they're just going to jump out of the way. So you'll do, yes. That's all part of it. And so there's almost a game theory element of it to racing Verstappen.
100%. So the way Norris is now, he doesn't need to be more aggressive necessarily. But he's proven to Verstappen, one, he's not just going to jump out Verstappen's way, but he's also proven to Verstappen he'll send one up the inside. He's going to make Verstappen think the next time that they race one another. He's proven he's not a soft touch. That's the first step. What happens from here depends on how Norris conducts himself in future wheel-to-wheel battles, and it's going to take place over multiple case studies. You don't want to judge too much on Austria and blow it out of proportion, because while it got away from Verstappen, that battle, it wasn't, constant swerving and brake checking and all of this. And
I actually think the movement and that kind of thing, I'm not keen on moving in the braking zones, etc. But I think it ended up being close to the line, but you can get away with that. I don't think that was disastrously problematic. I understand why Norris was frustrated by it, but he's as we said, he's getting close to the line.
I still think there should have been a black and white flag one incident before they collided, because there was one early that I thought, I think the first one, I think it was the first one, and I was like, that was already straight away quite obvious. So again, that's the kind of thing where maybe that necessitates a slightly more prompt intervention of that wasn't itself worth a penalty, but if we see you doing that again, that's a pattern, and we're not having that.
That's what the black and white flag's for.
Yeah, exactly.
Which there's a lot of these things that are forgotten.
So going back to that earlier question about should not, I know the question wasn't about making an example of Verstappen or finally whatever, but that's the kind of thing that I think people can get frustrated about and be like, well, why isn't this stuff applied? So yeah, that's kind of where I'm at with it. I don't think Norris doesn't need to go out this weekend and send one down the inside at cops or anything like that, prove himself or scare Verstappen or anything like that. Just don't back down, because that goes for any driver. That it isn't, this isn't a rallying cry for drivers to take Verstappen on or anything like that. It's just Verstappen, as Horner has said himself, Verstappen's own team boss, he's a hard racer. He's not going to change. if you let yourself be bullied or anything like that by that driver, he's got you on toast every single time you go up against him. Verstappen's got that mental edge. More often than not, that's not always going to end the way it did in Austria, but it will just end with Verstappen winning.
Yeah, Norris certainly has to still improve on that. There were good things in racecraft he did in Austria and bad things as well, so he still needs to improve. And, like we said, there was at least one time when his dive up the inside was just too optimistic, so he needs to sharpen that. This also feeds back into that thing about the racing rules and the way things are done. You've got to be a little bit careful, because if you get into that thing of drivers having to be quite aggressive with each other and stand your ground, you will get more collisions. And I do think there's a general problem. And again, it's not a Verstappen problem, it's an F1 problem in terms of the way on-track stuff is governed and applied. And I don't think it's helpful framing it purely as Verstappen. I think Verstappen will do what he's able to get away with, plus a few percent more probably. That's his approach. But he won't do things if he continually doesn't get away with them as well, because that's the game he's playing. So yeah, tricky opponent, and Norris still has something to prove on that. But and it's a question, does he need to be more aggressive? I don't think he was not aggressive in Austria ultimately.
He was very aggressive in Austria.
He was, and I think the main thing is he wasn't aggressive in defence in the sprint race. That was for me, I thought that was a terrible bit of racecraft from Norris, just not covering the inside. It was absolutely rookie stuff, that one. I was very, very surprised by that. Right, Scott, Aston Martin, they've announced Andy Cowell, former Mercedes HPP boss, as its new CEO. He starts on October the 1st, takes over from Martin Whitmarsh. How significant a bit of recruitment is that?
Yeah, it's very significant. Obviously, Whitmarsh going is theoretically a loss. I haven't heard anything to suggest that he was a disaster in that role or anything like that. And that was
But he has been publicly, he's been quite quiet. He hasn't been a conspicuous figure, which he doesn't have to be.
He was very front and centre with the Honda deal, and that's about as much as I can think of in terms of anything that he has sort of, been really, really in the middle of. But I'm sure with some of the high-level recruitment, he was there. And one of the good things I think that Whitmarsh brought to it early on was there was a certain credibility and poise that he brought to the project. There was well, hang on a second, this guy hasn't been in F1, so this has to be proper for him to be back involved. But someone like Cowell coming in, I think, is very, very significant when we're 18 months away from a works on engine situation for Aston Martin with the Honda partnership for 26. So that will be fascinating to me, because as listeners of any podcast that Gary Anderson has ever appeared on, probably over the last 10 or 15 years, will know that Honda has historically been quite difficult and not particularly open to outside influence. But that changed quite a bit in the Red Bull years, that they responded so well to the way that Red Bull wanted to work with them. So it will be, I think the culture is slightly different, or the potentially slightly different from Honda in terms of taking advice from the outside and knowing how to work on collaboration and integration of the power unit in the chassis. They've learned a lot from the Red Bull days, and there's a reasonable amount of carryover in the Honda project. It's not entirely identical, and some of the leaders are different or in different positions, but there's a lot of opportunity to build on what they've done in the Red Bull years, and Cowell could be an enormous weapon in that. He's not going there with he's not in that particular role for his sole job to be head of power unit integration or anything like that. But to have that level of knowledge in the organisation for starters is massive for Aston. To have it there when they're going to be plotting how to maximise the 2026 regs, I don't want to say game changer, because I think that Honda is an incredible organisation in its own right, and look at what it has achieved in the last few years in F1. But that Cowell appointment can be the difference between Aston and Honda sort of floundering a little and making good on its potential. That's how much of an influence he can have.
Yeah, I certainly agree with all that. I think he offers a lot more as well, though, because obviously, he's a technical guy, he's an engineer, designer. The engine side's been his area of expertise, but he's very, very good in terms of what you might call technical organisation. And I think when you look at that team, it's not difficult to come to the conclusion that their technical organisation doesn't seem to be working as well as it should do. And sometimes having someone like that in a position who can really look at that, Whitmarsh is capable of doing that as well, but I think Cowell's another level in that regard. So I think probably he's also someone who will be quite helpful in that regard, in terms of just making sure all those people they've thrown together on the technical side are working well as well. So that's very valuable. He's a sharp guy, Cowell, and I think he'll be a hugely valuable asset to that team. There's a connected question, not about Cowell, but about Aston Martin, that I'll take on from Alexander Law, who says, why has Aston Martin struggled to keep up the development pace with the front-running teams? It seems that developments are not making the kind of gains that, say, Mercedes or even McLaren have made with their new parts. Is there something amiss with their new factory, correlation, for example, or is driver feedback also playing their part in diminishing competitiveness? Well, it's always correlation, really, isn't it? But they're putting upgrades on the car that are either don't yield the return expected, or they may yield the return expected but without the characteristics anticipated. And that's the thing, these are very three-dimensional challenges, upgrading these cars. And basically Aston Martin keeps getting a bit lost with these upgrades. This was happening last year, it's happening this year as well. So that's why they're struggling. I think it's not specifically anything amiss with the new factory in terms of tools. Correlation, any simulation tool you use, wind tunnel, CFD, there's all manner of simulation tools that will spit out answers. They're only approximations of reality. That's always the nature of it. Plus also they will spit out data, and it's the way you apply that data and interpret that's crucial. So I suspect there's some processes there doing it. It's just down to developing that underlying science, and they seem to be in a little bit of a circle. But as we've seen from a number of teams, you can get a little bit stuck and go around in circles a bit, and then some things click and suddenly you take a step forward. So that will be what they're hoping for.
I can see three things there that could be causing, not problems, but three sort of broad challenges for them to address in this. One is the gradual development of the facility overall, because not the new factory is not completely finished, is it? And they're still using the Merc tunnel at the moment.
Yeah, the wind tunnel won't be online until the end of the year, so the 25 car's still being developed in the Merc tunnel as well. And although the main bit of the factory, because I think they say 1/3 of the campus is complete, but it's a lot of the ancillary stuff that's not done. The main building, with a lot of it in the design office and all these things and the facilities on the floor below it, is all there. But yeah, it's still, there's been a disruptive element to that, no question. But I don't think it's the main reason.
No, but it shows the team is, one, a work in progress, and two, as you said, there have been disruptions and distractions, I think within it. So that's one challenge that it needs to address. Another challenge I think it might need to address is technical super teams are all well and good, but engineers can come with ego and different ideas and ways of doing things, and getting all of that to kind of meld together isn't easy. And when you look at where they've sort of brought people in, I do wonder if that is working as efficiently as it can. Is everybody talking to each other and working collaboratively in the way they need to? How are they also then feeding in the recruitment into that? Because that team's grown a lot over the last few years, and I think is still growing. So at what point do different people join? How do they feed into the process? Is that as harmonious as it can be? And I do wonder if Cowell could be quite good at that. Okay, at Mercedes, for example, he was on the HPP side, so it wasn't about a team itself, car development, but in terms of structures and people working together and getting ideas out of people, he's very good at that. That's the second challenge. The third challenge with it is, I just wonder whether or not the build up to 2026 risks being a little bit of this will all be fine by 2026, because, different example, but look at how many times with McLaren did we hear, we need to be winning races by 25 or 26 because that's when we'll have everything. And then, to be fair, I think Zach Brown said last year in Abu Dhabi that actually one of the things that was really good when Andrea Stella came in was that kind of okay, are we maximising the here and now? And look at what they've done. Okay, they're now in the new facilities that they have at Woking, but all that stuff they did last year to transform the car and become podium finishers and challengers for victory, that came with the same tools that had underachieved in 22 and 23. So I do wonder if there's a missed opportunity there at Aston in the same way.
It can be too easy to fall into that. I think Formula One teams, they have to think strategically, and they are slow moving, but you also need the day-to-day to be really fast moving and thinking, are you using everything correctly? And one of the things that McLaren did was they did change the way they were interpreting and using the wind tunnel data. So it's the same data, but with the way the cars have changed, and now these Venturi tunnel cars very sensitive to the ground, you have to take a slightly different approach to as you did with the previous one. So that's a big question. And I think the other thing, this is connected to your second point with, lots of people coming in from loads of different teams. There was always a question mark for me, or something they just needed to prove, not that I doubted, but was yet to be tested. When you bring lots of people in from lots of different teams, you do bring in lots of ideas, and you can kind of throw all these ideas together, and that can be quite good. But you've got to then be self-sustaining in generating those ideas. You've got to be self-sustaining in developing the underlying science. You've got to be sure that you're really understanding all of this stuff. And I think maybe that's the process Aston Martin's going through. And it's very, very difficult because obviously the expectations got distorted by where they were at the start of last year. Although I think while you can't be expected to be second best to Red Bull consistently after that point, they have slid back in relative terms as well. So it's not like they've held position. They were sort of 0.6, 0.7% off on outright pace in that phase, and they've slipped further back. And you look at Austria, they're probably the 9th best car maybe, and that's the circuit that's basically got your highest amount of grip limited as a percentage, which just fits in with what Fernando Alonso's been saying. The car just hasn't got enough usable downforce in that they're just lacking grip because of that. So I feel like there's something they're butting up against that they need to break through technically, and whether they get there will depend on how well it's working. There's talk about other new recruits, Enrico Cardile, people like that are being linked with the team, and I'm interested to see with where they go. I just hope that there's not impatience there. We know the approach Lawrence Stroll takes, and I get the feeling there's a team that's got some underlying tension there, which is never good for a team culturally. I get the feeling that they are, compare how frank and open, say, McLaren over the past few years have been about their problems and where they need to improve, and then they delivered on that with the frankness of Aston Martin, which did slightly improve actually in Austria. There was a slight improvement in terms of admitting problems and weaknesses, so that's encouraging. But that team needs to be brutally honest with itself. That's the only way any F1 team gets anywhere. Well, thanks very much, Scott. We're going to be heading off to Silverstone, so stay with us for everything you need to know from the British Grand Prix.
The Athletic.